The autumn wind swept through Cedar Creek, Texas, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and unfulfilled promises. Rebecca Williams stood behind the counter of Cedar Creek Family Diner, her weathered hands trembling as she stared at the eviction notice that had arrived that morning. The paper seemed to mock her with its official letterhead and cold, impersonal language. Final notice, 30 days to vacate premises. At 45, Rebecca looked older than her years. The stress lines around her green eyes told stories of sleepless nights spent balancing books that never seemed to balance, of mornings that started at 4 a.m. and evenings that ended well past midnight. Her auburn hair, once vibrant and full, now hung limp around her shoulders, streaked with premature gray that she no longer bothered to cover. The diner itself reflected her exhaustion. What had once been the heart of Cedar Creek, a place where 3 generations of the Williams family had served comfort food and created memories, now showed signs of neglect born from necessity rather than choice. The red vinyl booths were cracked and patched with duct tape, the linoleum floor worn thin in places, and the ancient coffee maker gurgled and wheezed like an old man's last breath. "Mom, you okay?" Tyler Williams, her 12-year-old son, peered at her from behind thick glasses that were held together with medical tape. His school backpack hung heavy on his thin shoulders. Weighted down with books, he struggled to read due to his dyslexia. The tutoring sessions he desperately needed cost $300 a month they didn't have. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Rebecca lied, quickly folding the eviction notice and shoving it into her apron pocket. "How was school today?" Tyler's face fell slightly. "Mrs. Patterson says I need to try harder with my reading. She doesn't understand that the letters keep jumping around." He paused, studying his mother's face with the intuitive wisdom that comes to children who've grown up too fast. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" Before Rebecca could answer, the front door burst open with such force that the little bell above it rang frantically. Jessica Williams, 16 and furious with the world, stormed in wearing ripped jeans and a black hoodie that smelled faintly of marijuana. Her blue eyes, so much like her mother's but harder somehow, swept over the nearly empty restaurant with undisguised contempt. "Great, another thriving evening at the family business," Jessica sneered, dropping her backpack with deliberate carelessness. "Maybe if we actually had customers, I wouldn't be the laughingstock of Cedar Creek High." "Jessica Ann Williams, that's enough," Rebecca snapped, her patience finally fraying. "This restaurant has been in our family for 67 years. Your great-grandmother started it with nothing but hope and hard work." "Yeah, well, look how well that turned out," Jessica shot back. "Dad sure couldn't wait to get away from this place. Smart man, if you ask me." The mention of David Williams hit Rebecca like a physical blow. 2 years had passed since her husband of 19 years had cleaned out their joint savings account and disappeared with his 23-year-old secretary, leaving behind only a note that said he needed to find himself. The divorce papers had arrived 6 months later, along with a lawyer's letter explaining that David had no intention of paying child support from his new life in California. "Don't talk about your father," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Why not? It's not like he's here to defend himself," Jessica continued, oblivious to or perhaps intentionally ignoring her mother's pain. "Face it, Mom. This place is dying, just like everything else in this stupid town. When I turn 18, I'm out of here, just like Dad." Tyler looked between his mother and sister with growing anxiety. At 12, he didn't fully understand all the family's problems, but he could feel the tension like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. "Jess, please don't fight with Mom. She's sad enough already." "Stay out of it, Tyler," Jessica snapped. "You're just a kid. You don't understand how trapped we all are." Rebecca felt tears threatening behind her eyes. The eviction notice seemed to burn through her apron pocket like a brand. She looked around the restaurant that had been her whole world, seeing it through Jessica's eyes, outdated, struggling, a relic of a time when small-town businesses could survive against corporate competition. The bell above the door chimed again, and Eleanor Williams shuffled in, moving with the uncertain gait that had become more pronounced in recent months. At 72, Rebecca's mother was still a handsome woman, but the early stages of Alzheimer's had begun to steal pieces of her away, leaving her confused and sometimes frightened in her own home. "Rebecca, dear," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that particular uncertainty that had become so familiar. "I can't remember. Did I feed Patches today? The poor cat keeps meowing at me, but I can't recall." Rebecca's heart clenched. Patches had been dead for 3 years, but she couldn't bear to remind her mother of that fact again. "I'll check on him in a bit, Mom. Why don't you sit down and I'll make you some tea?" Eleanor nodded gratefully and settled into her usual booth by the window, the one that looked out onto Main Street, where she could watch for customers who rarely came anymore. The specialized memory care facility that Eleanor needed cost $4,000 a month, money that might as well have been $4 million for all the chance Rebecca had of affording it. The ancient cash register gave its familiar wheeze as Rebecca opened it to count the day's earnings. $37.43. It wasn't enough to buy groceries for the family, let alone pay the electric bill that was already 2 months overdue. As if summoned by her thoughts, the lights flickered ominously. The power company had been calling twice a day for the past week, their automated messages a constant reminder of yet another bill she couldn't pay. The property taxes were 6 months behind, the supplier bills were piling up, and the bank had made it clear that the restaurant's business loan was in default. Jessica flopped into a booth with theatrical disgust. "God, this place is depressing. Can't you at least turn on some music or something?" Rebecca walked over to the old jukebox in the corner, a 1950s Wurlitzer that had been her great-grandmother's pride and joy. She fed it a quarter she couldn't afford to spare and selected B7, George Strait's Amarillo Morning. The familiar melody filled the restaurant, and for just a moment, Rebecca could remember being 7 years old again, dancing on these same worn floors while her grandmother cooked, and her grandfather told stories to the regular customers who came in every day like clockwork. "Turn that country garbage off," Jessica groaned. "No wonder this place can't attract anyone under the age of 70. "This country garbage is your heritage," Rebecca said firmly. "Your great-grandmother loved George Strait. She always said his music reminded her that there was still goodness in the world." Tyler looked up from his homework, which he'd spread across a corner table. "I like it, Mom. It sounds like when you're happy." The simple observation from her youngest child nearly broke Rebecca's composure entirely. When had she stopped being happy? When had the weight of keeping everything together become so overwhelming that she'd forgotten what joy felt like? The front door opened again, and Rebecca looked up hopefully, thinking it might be a customer. Instead, it was Jake Morrison, her ex-husband's former business partner and the closest thing to a friend she had left in Cedar Creek. Jake's weathered face was grim as he approached the counter, his work boots leaving small, muddy prints on the floor. "Rebecca, we need to talk," Jake said quietly, glancing meaningfully at the children. "Kids, why don't you go upstairs and start on your homework?" Rebecca suggested. The family lived in a small apartment above the restaurant, a practical arrangement that had become a necessity when money got tight. Jessica rolled her eyes. "I'm not a kid, Mom." "Then act like it and help your brother with his reading," Rebecca snapped with unusual sharpness. Something in her tone must have penetrated Jessica's rebellious facade, because she actually stood up and ushered Tyler toward the back stairs without further argument. Eleanor remained in her booth, humming along to the jukebox and seemingly lost in memories of better times. Jake waited until the children were out of earshot before speaking. "Rebecca, I heard about the eviction notice. Tom Bradley down at the bank called me." Rebecca's face flushed with embarrassment. Tom Bradley was Jake's cousin and the president of Cedar Creek First National. The fact that her financial troubles were being discussed among her social circle made her want to disappear into the worn linoleum floor. "It's temporary," she said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "I'm working on a solution." Jake's expression was kind but skeptical. "Honey, you've been working on a solution for 2 years, ever since David—" He trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. "Ever since David what? Left me with 3 kids, a failing business, and a mountain of debt? Ever since he cleaned out our savings to fund his midlife crisis? Ever since he decided that his family wasn't worth fighting for?" The words poured out of Rebecca like water from a burst dam, carrying with them all the hurt and anger she'd been suppressing for months. Jake reached across the counter and gently took her hand. "Rebecca, you know I'd help if I could. But the construction business has been slow this year. The new development they were planning got cancelled, and I've had to let go 3 of my guys." Rebecca nodded, pulling her hand away. She knew Jake was struggling too. The whole town was. Cedar Creek had been dying a slow death for years, ever since the interstate bypass had diverted traffic away from Main Street. The arrival of a big box store and chain restaurants on the highway had been the final nail in the coffin for most local businesses. "What am I going to do, Jake?" Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle crooning of George Strait from the jukebox. "This restaurant is all I know. It's all I've ever known. My great-grandmother built this place with her bare hands during the Depression. My grandmother kept it going through World War II and the Korean War. My mother raised me here. This isn't just a business, it's our family legacy." "I know, sweetheart," Jake said softly, "but maybe it's time to think about other options. You're young, you're smart, you could start over somewhere else." "With what money? And where would I go? Jessica's got 2 more years of high school. Tyler needs specialized help for his learning disabilities, and Mom—" Rebecca's voice broke as she looked over at Eleanor, who was now talking quietly to someone who wasn't there. "She's getting worse, Jake. Yesterday she forgot who I was for almost an hour. She kept asking for her mother." The bell above the door chimed, and both Rebecca and Jake looked up hopefully. A young couple entered, tourists by the look of their expensive clothes and rental car plates. They glanced around the restaurant with barely concealed disdain before quickly backing toward the door. "Actually, we just remembered we have dinner reservations elsewhere," the woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "This place looks like it hasn't been updated since the 1970s. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with shame as the couple left. Jake's jaw tightened with anger. "Ignorant city folks," he muttered. "They wouldn't know authentic character if it bit them on the ass." But Rebecca barely heard him. She was staring at the eviction notice she'd pulled from her pocket, reading the words again and again, as if they might somehow change. 30 days. In 30 days, she would lose everything her family had built over 3 generations. The weight of it all suddenly crashed down on her like a physical force. The unpaid bills, the broken equipment, Jessica's drug use that she pretended not to know about, Tyler's struggles in school, Eleanor's declining health, the empty restaurant that used to be filled with laughter and conversation. It was too much. It was all too much. Rebecca felt her knees buckle as a sob escaped her throat. She sank down behind the counter, her body shaking with the force of emotion she'd been holding back for months. All the strength, all the determination, all the hope she'd been clinging to suddenly abandoned her, leaving her feeling hollow and defeated. "Rebecca!" Jake rushed around the counter and knelt beside her, his strong arms encircling her shaking form. "It's okay, honey. It's going to be okay." But Rebecca couldn't stop crying. Years of suppressed grief and fear poured out of her in great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She cried for her failed marriage, for her struggling children, for her sick mother, for the restaurant that was more than a business, but a piece of her very identity. Through her tears, she was vaguely aware of the jukebox finishing George Strait's song and falling silent, of Eleanor calling out in confusion, of the sound of footsteps upstairs as Tyler and Jessica moved around in their shared bedroom. The familiar sounds of her life, the life that was about to crumble around her. Outside, the autumn wind continued to blow, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the restaurant's large front windows. In 30 days, the Cedar Creek family diner would be just another casualty of progress, another piece of small-town America lost to time and economic reality. Rebecca Williams had finally reached her breaking point, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to pick up the pieces and start again. The rain that had threatened all evening finally began in earnest as dusk settled over Cedar Creek. Rebecca had managed to compose herself enough to finish the dinner service, though service was perhaps too generous a word for heating up 2 plates of meatloaf for Bill Henderson, the town's retired postal worker who came in every Tuesday like clockwork. Jake had stayed to help her clean up, his presence a comfort even though they both knew there was little he could actually do to solve her problems. Eleanor had dozed off in her booth, her silver head resting against the window where she watched for customers who would never come. The rhythmic sound of her gentle snoring mixed with the patter of rain against glass and the hum of the ancient refrigeration units. "Mom, can we talk?" Jessica appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her earlier hostility replaced by something that looked almost like concern. She'd changed out of her rebellious teenage uniform into a simple t-shirt and jeans, and without her armor of attitude, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Rebecca looked up from wiping down the grill, noting that her daughter's eyes were clearer than they'd been in weeks. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking to Jake and then away. "It's just, Tyler's upstairs crying. He thinks it's his fault that we're broke because of all the money you spend on his tutoring." Rebecca's heart clenched. She'd been so focused on her own problems that she hadn't considered how her 12-year-old son might be interpreting their financial struggles. "That's not true. Tyler's education is important, and his learning challenges aren't his fault. I know that, and you know that. But he's a kid. He hears us fighting about money, and he sees those medical bills from his testing, and he thinks—" Jessica's voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Jake cleared his throat gently. "Maybe I should head home, give you ladies some privacy." "No, stay," Rebecca said quickly. Jake's steady presence had been the only thing keeping her grounded all day. "You're practically family anyway." Jessica raised an eyebrow at that but didn't comment. Instead, she moved closer to the counter, her fingers tracing patterns in a small puddle of spilled coffee. "Mom, I've been thinking, maybe I could get a job after school, help out with the bills." Rebecca stared at her daughter in surprise. "Jess, you're 16. Your job is to focus on school and graduate." "What's the point?" Jessica's old bitterness crept back into her voice. "Even if I get good grades, we can't afford college. And don't tell me about scholarships. My grades are decent, but they're not scholarship material. Not with all the times I've missed school this year." The admission hung in the air between them. Rebecca knew Jessica had been skipping classes, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. "Why have you been missing school?" Jessica's cheeks flushed pink. "Sometimes I stay home to help Grandma when she's having bad days. Last week she forgot how to use the stove and nearly burned the apartment down, trying to make coffee." Rebecca felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. She'd been so busy trying to keep the restaurant afloat that she'd missed signs that her mother's condition was worsening. "Jess, you should have told me." "When? You're here 18 hours a day, and when you're not, you're upstairs paying bills or trying to fix something that's broken." Jessica's voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. "I know you're doing your best, Mom. I really do, but I also know we're drowning." Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling like he was intruding on a family moment. "I could check on Eleanor during the day," he offered. I'm usually done with work by 3, and it's not like I have anywhere else to be. Jake, I can't ask you to do that, Rebecca protested. You're not asking, I'm offering. His weathered face was kind, but determined. Eleanor helped my mom out when she was sick, remember? It's the least I can do. Before Rebecca could respond, the front door opened with such force that all 3 of them turned in surprise. A tall figure in a rain-soaked cowboy hat stepped inside, shaking drops of water from an expensive-looking leather jacket. For a moment, Rebecca thought it might be another tourist seeking shelter from the storm. Then the man removed his hat and turned toward them, and Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. It was George Strait. Not someone who looked like George Strait, not an impersonator or a lookalike, but the actual king of country music himself. Rebecca recognized him instantly from the dozens of album covers and concert posters that had decorated her great-grandmother's apartment, and later her own teenage bedroom wall. "Evening," George said in that distinctive voice that had sold over 100 million records worldwide. "I hope you don't mind me coming in. My truck broke down about a mile back, and this was the first place I saw with lights on." Rebecca stared at him, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to form words. Jake recovered first, stepping forward with his hand extended. "Of course. Come in. Come in," Jake said, his voice only slightly shakier than usual. "I'm Jake Morrison, and this is Rebecca Williams. She owns this place." George shook Jake's hand with genuine warmth, then turned to Rebecca with that famous smile that had charmed audiences for decades. "Mrs. Williams, I hope it's not too much trouble. I was heading up to Dallas for a show tomorrow, but it looks like Mother Nature had other plans." Finally finding her voice, Rebecca managed to stammer, No trouble at all. Please sit wherever you'd like. Can I get you some coffee? Something to eat?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." George glanced around the restaurant, and Rebecca cringed inwardly as she tried to see it through his eyes. The duct-taped booths, the worn linoleum, the outdated decor that spoke of better times long past. But instead of the disdain she expected, George's expression was one of genuine appreciation. "This is a beautiful place you have here. Reminds me of the diner my grandfather used to take me to when I was a boy down in Poteet." Jessica, who had been staring at George with the same stunned expression as her mother, suddenly seemed to come back to life. "Oh my God, you're George Strait. You're actually George Strait," George chuckled, settling into a booth near the counter. "Last time I checked, yes, ma'am. And you are?" Jessica Williams. "This is my mum's restaurant." Jessica's attitude had completely transformed. Gone was the sullen teenager, replaced by a starstruck young woman who looked like she might faint from excitement. "Jessica, why don't you go get Tyler?" Rebecca suggested, finally finding her composure. "He'd love to meet Mr. Strait." "Please, just call me George," he said warmly, "and I'd be honored to meet the rest of your family." As Jessica thundered up the stairs, calling for Tyler in a voice pitched high with excitement, Rebecca moved behind the counter on unsteady legs. She couldn't believe this was happening. George Strait, the man whose music had provided the soundtrack to 3 generations of her family's life, was sitting in their failing restaurant asking for a cup of coffee. "I have to tell you," George said, watching as Rebecca poured coffee from the ancient machine that somehow managed to brew a decent cup, despite its age. "I heard your jukebox playing Amarillo Morning when I was outside. Haven't heard that old Wurlitzer sound in years. My grandmother had one just like it." Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she set the coffee cup in front of him. "My great-grandmother bought that jukebox in 1952. She always said music made the food taste better." "Smart woman." George took a sip of the coffee and made an appreciative sound. "This is excellent coffee, Mrs. Williams." "Rebecca, if I may." She nodded, still hardly believing this was real. "It's the one thing we've never skimped on. Good coffee and honest food. That was always the family motto." Eleanor stirred in her booth, blinking slowly as she tried to focus on the newcomer. "Excuse me, young man," she said in the polite but uncertain voice that had become so familiar, "but you look like someone I should know. Are you one of Rebecca's friends from school?" Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Mom, this is—" But George held up a gentle hand, rising from his booth to approach Eleanor with the kind of respectful deference usually reserved for royalty. "Ma'am, I'm George Strait. I'm a singer, and I'm honored to meet you." Eleanor's face lit up with sudden recognition and delight. "George Strait! Oh my heavens, Rebecca, it's George Strait. I have all his albums upstairs. Unwound was my favorite dancing song when your grandfather was courting me." For a moment, the clouds of confusion that had been gathering in Eleanor's mind seemed to part, revealing glimpses of the sharp, vibrant woman she'd once been. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched her mother transform in the presence of this unexpected visitor. "Unwound is one of my favorites too," George said, taking Eleanor's hand gently in both of his. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a while? I'd love to hear about your dancing days." Tyler appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his thick glasses slightly askew and his hair sticking up in all directions. He took one look at George and froze, his mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. "Tyler, come here, sweetheart," Rebecca called softly. "I'd like you to meet someone very special." Tyler approached slowly, his natural shyness warring with curiosity. George extended his hand for a shake, treating the 12-year-old with the same respect he'd shown Eleanor. "You must be Tyler. I'm George. Your mum tells me you're quite a reader." Tyler's face fell slightly. "Not really. The words get all jumbled up for me. Mum says it's called dyslexia, but it just makes me feel stupid." "Well, that's nonsense," George said firmly. "Some of the smartest, most creative people I know have dyslexia. You just process information differently, and that can actually be a gift. I bet you see patterns and connections that other people miss." Tyler's eyes widened behind his glasses. "Really? You know other people like me?" "I sure do. And every single one of them is special in their own way." George's voice was warm with sincerity. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than brilliant, son. The world needs people who think differently." Rebecca watched this interaction with a growing sense of unreality. Here was one of the most famous men in America, sitting in her rundown restaurant, treating her family with a kindness and respect that took her breath away. For the first time in months, she saw Tyler stand a little straighter, his shoulders squaring with something that looked like pride. Jake, who had been quietly observing from behind the counter, suddenly straightened and snapped his fingers. "I just remembered. My brother-in-law Carl runs the auto shop about 5 miles down the road. I could give him a call, see if he can take a look at your truck." "That would be incredibly kind," George replied. "I don't want to put anyone out, though. I'm sure it's nothing major, probably just the alternator giving up the ghost." "Carl's good people," Jake assured him, already reaching for his phone. "He'll take care of you." As Jake stepped outside to make the call, Rebecca found herself alone with George and her family for the first time. The surreal quality of the situation seemed to intensify in the relative quiet, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. "This is such a lovely place," George said, his eyes taking in the details that Rebecca had stopped seeing years ago. "You can feel the history in these walls. How long has it been in your family?" 67 years, Rebecca replied, unconsciously straightening with pride. "My great-grandmother Rose Williams opened it in 1958. She was a widow with 3 children and nothing but determination." Rose Williams," George repeated thoughtfully. "You know, I think I may have met her once, years ago. Would have been in the early 80s when I was just starting out. I was playing some small venues in East Texas, and there was this diner. The owner was an elderly lady who made the best apple pie I'd ever tasted. She talked about her great-granddaughter who was going to carry on the family tradition." Rebecca's eyes widened. That could have been her. She was still working then, though she was well into her 70s, and she was famous for her apple pie. I remember she gave me a free slice and told me to sing pretty for the folks. She said music and good food were the two things that could heal any hurt. George smiled at the memory. Wise woman. The story hung in the air between them, a connection spanning decades that felt both impossible and perfectly natural. Eleanor, who had been listening with growing excitement, suddenly clapped her hands together. Rebecca, you must make George some of Rose's apple pie. The recipe is in the kitchen, in that old wooden box by the spice rack. Rebecca's face fell. Mom, we don't have the ingredients. The last supplier delivery was over a week ago, and I haven't been able to... She stopped herself, not wanting to air the family's financial troubles in front of this unexpected guest. But George's perceptive eyes had already caught the hesitation, the flush of embarrassment that colored her cheeks. You know what? He said casually. I noticed a grocery store down the road when I was driving through town. Why don't I run over and pick up whatever you need? I'd love to try that famous apple pie, and it would give me something to do while we wait for the truck to get fixed. Oh no, I couldn't let you do that, Rebecca protested quickly. You're our guest, and besides, the store is probably closed by now. Jake chose that moment to return, shaking rain from his hair as he pocketed his phone. Carl says he can come take a look at the truck, but it'll be at least an hour before he can get here. Storm's got a tree down across Route 12. Perfect, George said, rising from his seat with decision. That gives us time to run to the store and get some pie ingredients. Jake, would you mind giving me directions to that grocery store I saw? Murphy's Market? Sure, but George is right. They close at 8 on weeknights. Jake glanced at his watch. It's already 8:30. George smiled. Well then, I guess we'll just have to see if old Murphy is feeling generous tonight. He walked over to the door and peered out at the rain, then turned back to the family with that infectious grin that had charmed audiences for decades. You know what? This is turning out to be the best breakdown I've ever had. Rebecca stared after him as he put his cowboy hat back on and prepared to venture out into the storm. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening, something that went beyond a famous singer needing help with his truck. There was a warmth in George's eyes when he looked at her family, a genuine care that seemed to encompass not just their immediate situation, but something deeper. As if reading her thoughts, Tyler tugged on her apron. Mom, is he like an angel or something? Rebecca looked down at her son, seeing hope in his eyes for the first time in months. I don't know, sweetheart, but he's certainly special. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the Cedar Creek family diner, something was beginning to shift. The worn booth where George had been sitting still seemed to radiate warmth, and the coffee cup he'd left behind bore the faintest impression of his smile. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca Williams allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Murphy's Market had indeed been closed, its neon open sign dark against the rain-slicked windows. But George Strait possessed a kind of gentle persistence that could move mountains, or in this case, convince old Murphy Henderson to reopen his store for 20 minutes on a Tuesday night. By the time George and Jake returned to the diner, they were laden with paper bags full of fresh apples, cinnamon, flour, and all the other ingredients needed for Rose Williams' legendary apple pie. I can't believe Murphy actually opened the store for you, Rebecca said, still shaking her head in amazement as she arranged the ingredients on the worn counter. Well, I may have mentioned that I'd be happy to sign some autographs for his grandchildren, George admitted with a sheepish grin, and possibly agreed to take a photo with him and his wife. Turns out they've been to 17 of my concerts over the years. Jessica, who had been following George's every move with starstruck attention, suddenly straightened. Wait, You've been to 17 George Strait concerts? That's like a lot of money. George paused in the act of removing his damp jacket, something in Jessica's tone catching his attention. It is quite a bit, yes. Why do you ask? Jessica glanced at her mother, then back at George, her teenage filter apparently completely broken. It's just, if people around here have money for 17 concerts, why aren't they eating at our restaurant? Are we really that bad? Jessica, Rebecca gasped, mortified by her daughter's bluntness. But George held up a hand, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. That's actually a very smart question, Jessica, and the answer is complicated. He settled back into his booth, his attention now fully focused on the teenager. Sometimes people will drive hours and spend hundreds of dollars on an experience they can't get at home, but they'll pass by amazing things in their own backyard without ever noticing them. Tyler, who had been quietly working on his homework at a corner table, looked up with interest. Like how I never see the good parts of books because I'm too busy struggling with the hard words? Exactly like that, George said warmly. Sometimes we need someone to point out the treasure that's been right in front of us all along. Eleanor, who had been dozing fitfully in her booth, suddenly sat up straight. Rebecca, dear, where's your great-grandmother's recipe box? The wooden one with the carved roses. Rebecca felt a familiar pang of sadness. Mum, you know we had to sell that last year. Remember when Tyler needed those medical tests? Eleanor's face crumpled with confusion and loss. But how will we make the pie? Rose always said the secret was in the proportions, and she never wrote them down exactly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Rebecca had tried to recreate her great-grandmother's famous apple pie dozens of times over the years, but without the original recipe and its carefully guarded secrets, her attempts had always fallen short. It was just another piece of family history that had been sacrificed on the altar of financial necessity. George watched this interaction with growing understanding, his perceptive eyes taking in not just the words being spoken, but the weight of loss and resignation that seemed to hang over the entire family. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, but determined. Well then, I guess we'll just have to figure it out together. Eleanor, you must remember some things about how Rose made her pie, and sometimes the best recipes come from the heart rather than measurements anyway. What followed was one of the most magical evenings Rebecca could remember in years. With George's encouragement, Eleanor began to recall fragments of her grandmother's baking techniques. How Rose would test the apples by their smell, how she'd add cinnamon until it felt right, how she'd roll the dough with a wooden pin that had belonged to her own mother. Tyler abandoned his homework to help measure ingredients, his usual frustration with numbers disappearing as George showed him how cooking was more about feel and intuition than precise calculations. Even Jessica shed her rebellious attitude, genuinely engaged as she peeled apples and listened to Eleanor's stories of the diner's golden years. Jake, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to tackle some of the restaurant's minor repair issues. Rebecca watched in amazement as he tightened loose screws on the wobbly tables, adjusted the ancient jukebox to eliminate its persistent static, and even managed to coax the temperamental coffee machine into running more smoothly. "You don't have to do that," Rebecca protested, but Jake waved her off. "Keeps my hands busy," he said simply. "Besides, this place has good bones, just needs a little love and attention." As the pie baked in the old oven, filling the restaurant with the warm sense of cinnamon and apples, George settled in to hear more about the diner's history. Eleanor, buoyed by the attention and the familiar activity of cooking, regaled him with stories that Rebecca hadn't heard in years. Rose opened this place with nothing but $100 loan from the church and a dream of feeding people, Eleanor said, her voice stronger and clearer than it had been in months. She used to say that a good meal could solve half the world's problems, and a kind word could handle the rest. George listened intently, occasionally asking questions that drew out more details. Rebecca found herself learning things about her own family's history that she'd never known. How Rose had hidden Jewish refugees in the restaurant's basement during the war. How she'd fed unemployed workers for free during the recession of the early 1970s. How she'd once talked a desperate young man out of suicide by simply sitting with him over coffee and apple pie until dawn. "Your great-grandmother sounds like an extraordinary woman," George said softly. "The kind of person who understood that hospitality isn't just about business. It's about making people feel like they belong somewhere." Tyler, who had been quietly absorbing every word, suddenly spoke up. "Is that why Mom cries sometimes when she looks at old pictures of the restaurant? Because she misses great-great-grandma Rose?" Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She hadn't realized Tyler had noticed her moments of private grief, the times when the weight of continuing the family legacy felt too heavy to bear. "I think," George said gently, "your mom cries because she loves this place and everything it represents. And sometimes love hurts, especially when you're afraid you might lose something precious." The simple statement hung in the air, cutting straight to the heart of Rebecca's deepest fears. She turned away, busying herself with checking the pie, but she could feel George's understanding gaze on her back. "Mom," Jessica said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell us these stories about great-great-grandma Rose? I always thought the restaurant was just, a job." Rebecca pulled the perfectly golden pie from the oven, using the time to gather her thoughts. "I guess I thought if you knew how special this place really was, it would hurt more when we lost it." The admission fell into the warm kitchen like a stone into still water, creating ripples of understanding among the group. George watched Rebecca's shoulders slump with the weight of words she'd been carrying alone for too long. "Rebecca," he said softly, "what do you mean when you say, 'when we lost it'?" For a moment, Rebecca considered deflecting, making light of her troubles the way she always did. But there was something about George's presence, not his fame, but his genuine warmth and interest, that made the usual pretenses feel impossible to maintain. "We have 30 days, she said simply, her back still turned to the group. "The bank is foreclosing. This will be the last month the Cedar Creek family diner is open." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant rumble of thunder. Rebecca steeled herself for the pity she was sure would follow, the awkward sympathy that would make her feel even smaller. Instead, George's voice was calm and thoughtful. What would it take to save it? Rebecca finally turned around, surprised by the directness of the question. "More money than we have. More customers than exist in this town. A miracle, basically." "How much money?" George pressed gently. Rebecca hesitated, then pulled the crumpled eviction notice from her apron pocket. The paper was soft from being folded and refolded, worried over like a rosary. $60,000. That's what we owe in back taxes, loan payments, and supplier bills. Even if we had it, I don't know how we'd keep the doors open with so few customers." George studied the paper she handed him, his expression unreadable. Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling the weight of problems too big for any one person to solve. Eleanor hummed softly to herself, lost again in memories of better times. "You know," George said slowly, "I've played a lot of small towns over the years, and I've noticed something about places like Cedar Creek. They're not dying because people don't care. They're dying because people have forgotten how to care together." Tyler looked up from where he'd been cutting neat slices of the pie. "What do you mean?" George accepted a plate of pie with a grateful smile, taking a bite that made his eyes close in appreciation. "This is incredible, by the way. Your great-great-grandmother would be proud." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What I mean is, most small towns have everything they need to thrive. Good people, beautiful places, businesses with heart and history. But somewhere along the way, they start believing they have to compete with the big cities instead of celebrating what makes them unique. Jessica frowned. But how can we compete with the chain restaurants out by the highway? They have marketing budgets and corporate backing, and you can't compete with them, George interrupted gently, and you shouldn't try. What you can do is offer something they never could: authenticity, history, personal connection. You can make people feel like they're part of something special instead of just another transaction. Rebecca felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, quickly tamped down by practical reality. It's a beautiful idea, George, but it takes more than good intentions. People in this town are struggling too. They can't afford to eat out just to support a local business. What if they weren't just eating out? George mused, taking another bite of pie. What if they were investing in their community? What if coming to the Cedar Creek Family Diner meant being part of something bigger than a meal? Jake, who had been quietly listening while testing the newly adjusted jukebox, suddenly straightened. You mean like the old barn-raising days, when the whole community would come together for a common cause? Exactly like that, George said, his eyes brightening with enthusiasm. What if we organized a community event? Something that would bring people together, raise awareness about the restaurant, and maybe even help with some of those financial troubles? Rebecca shook her head, though something in her chest was beginning to warm despite her skepticism. George, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but a community event won't generate $60,000. And honestly, most folks around here are dealing with their own problems. You'd be surprised what people will do when they understand what's at stake, George said quietly. And you'd be amazed how many problems can be solved when a community decides to solve them together. Eleanor, who had been listening with growing alertness, suddenly clapped her hands together. A benefit concert. We used to have them all the time when I was young. Remember, Rebecca, when the Hendersons lost their farm in the drought of '88, the whole town came together and raised enough money to help them start over. George's smile grew wide. Now that's an idea worth exploring. A benefit concert. Jessica's voice was skeptical. Who would we get to perform? The closest thing to a celebrity in this town is Pastor Jim, and he can barely carry a tune. George's smile turned mysterious. Well, I do happen to know a singer or two who might be interested in helping out. The implications of his words slowly sank in. Rebecca stared at him, her mouth slightly open. You would do that? Perform at a benefit concert for us? Rebecca, this restaurant represents everything I believe in about American values. Hard work, family traditions, community spirit. If I can help preserve that, it would be my honor. Tyler dropped his fork with a clatter, his eyes wide behind his glasses. George Strait wants to do a concert for our restaurant. This is the best day ever. Even Jessica looked stunned by the possibility. But wouldn't that cost a lot of money? Sound equipment and stages and stuff? Those are details, George said dismissively. I know people who would be happy to help with the logistics. The question is, would the community support something like this? Jake, who had been growing more excited by the minute, began pacing behind the counter. Are you kidding? A George Strait concert in Cedar Creek? We'd have people coming from 3 states over. We could hold it at the high school football field, maybe charge $50 a ticket. 100, George corrected. And we'd need more than just ticket sales. Corporate sponsors, local business participation, maybe some silent auction items. Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the sudden turn the evening had taken. A few hours ago, she'd been crying over an eviction notice, and now they were discussing a benefit concert featuring one of the most successful artists in country music history. This is crazy, she whispered, but her voice carried wonder rather than dismissal. The best ideas usually are, George replied with a grin. But here's the thing. Even if we raise the money to pay off your debts, that's only the beginning. The real challenge will be building a sustainable future for this place. Eleanor, whose moments of clarity seemed to be lasting longer in George's presence, leaned forward with sudden intensity. Rose always said this restaurant was never really about the food. It was about being a gathering place, somewhere people could come together and remember they weren't alone. "Your great-grandmother was a wise woman," George said softly, "and I think she'd be proud to know her legacy might inspire a whole community to come together." Rebecca looked around the restaurant with new eyes, seeing it not as a failing business, but as the centerpiece of George's vision, a place where community could happen, where people could connect over good food and shared purpose. The timer on the old oven chimed, and Jessica jumped up to check on a second pie they'd started. "This one's perfect too," she announced, her voice filled with pride. "Then I think we have the start of a plan," George said, rising from his booth. "Good food, good music, good people. What more do you need for success?" Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, and the first hints of stars were visible through breaking clouds. But inside the Cedar Creek family diner, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that might just change everything. As if summoned by their newfound optimism, car headlights swept across the restaurant's front windows. Carl, Jake's brother-in-law, had arrived to look at George's truck. "Well," George said, putting his cowboy hat back on, "I guess it's time to see if my evening in Cedar Creek is ending or just beginning." Rebecca walked him to the door, still hardly believing the turn her life had taken in just a few short hours. "George, I don't know how to thank you. For the groceries, for listening to our stories, for everything." George paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Rebecca, 30 years ago, a wise old woman in a diner a lot like this one, gave me a free piece of apple pie and told me to sing pretty for the folks. Tonight, you and your family reminded me why that advice was so important. I should be thanking you." He stepped out into the night, leaving Rebecca standing in the doorway, watching as he walked toward his truck and the mechanic who was already lifting the hood. The rain had stopped completely now, and the air smelled clean and full of possibility. Behind her, she could hear Tyler and Jessica cleaning up the kitchen, their voices animated with plans and dreams they hadn't dared to voice in months. Eleanor was humming an old George Strait song, her fingers tapping out the rhythm on the table. For the first time since David had walked out of their lives, Rebecca Williams allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The news of George Strait's impromptu visit to the Cedar Creek family diner spread through the small town like wildfire. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Rebecca's phone had rung 17 times, and a steady stream of locals had begun appearing at the restaurant's front door, eager to hear the story firsthand and maybe catch a glimpse of where the king of country music had sat. Rebecca found herself telling the story over and over, each retelling making the previous evening feel more surreal. Yes, George Strait had really been there. Yes, he'd eaten their apple pie and pronounced it excellent. And yes, he'd mentioned the possibility of a benefit concert, though Rebecca was careful to emphasize that nothing was confirmed yet. "I still can't believe it," said Martha Patterson, Tyler's teacher, as she nursed her third cup of coffee at the counter. "George Strait, right here in our little diner. Wait until I tell my sister in Dallas. She's been to every one of his concerts for the past 15 years. Rebecca smiled as she refilled Martha's cup, noting that the teacher's attitude toward Tyler's learning challenges seemed to have softened considerably since learning about George's encouraging words to her son. Word had already gotten around about George's comments regarding dyslexia and creative thinking, and Rebecca had fielded several calls from other parents in similar situations. "Mom, there's a reporter here," Jessica announced, appearing from the back room where she'd been helping Eleanor get dressed for the day. At 17, Jessica had appointed herself the family's unofficial publicist, and she was clearly relishing the attention their restaurant was suddenly receiving. Rebecca looked toward the front door and saw a young woman with a press badge and a determined expression waiting to be seated. "Oh no," she muttered under her breath. "Don't worry," Jake said from behind the grill, where he'd been helping with the unexpected breakfast rush. "Linda Morrison from the Cedar Creek Gazette is good people. She won't sensationalize anything." Linda Morrison turned out to be Jake's niece, a recent journalism graduate who was working for the local paper while saving money for graduate school. She was professional but kind, asking thoughtful questions about the restaurant's history and the family's connection to George Strait's music. "What I'd really like to focus on," Linda explained as she took notes, "is how this visit represents something larger about small-town values and community support. Would you be comfortable if I wrote about the challenges the restaurant has been facing?" Rebecca hesitated. She'd spent so long trying to hide their financial troubles that the idea of having them printed in the newspaper felt terrifying. But George's words from the previous evening echoed in her mind. Sometimes communities needed to understand what was at stake before they could come together to help. "I think," Rebecca said carefully, "that transparency might be the first step toward the kind of community George was talking about." The interview lasted an hour, and by the time Linda left, Rebecca felt drained but oddly hopeful. For the first time in years, someone was telling the story of the Cedar Creek family diner not as a failing business, but as a vital piece of community history worth preserving. Around noon, as the breakfast crowd was finally thinning out, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. George Strait, looking remarkably ordinary in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, stepped inside with a smile that lit up the entire restaurant. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by again," he said to Rebecca, who was so surprised she nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night." The few remaining customers immediately recognized him, but George's easy manner and Rebecca's introduction kept the atmosphere comfortable rather than chaotic. He signed a few autographs and posed for pictures, but his primary focus was clearly on business. "I made some calls this morning," he said once they'd settled into a quiet booth in the back. "I've got tentative commitments from several artists who would be interested in participating in a benefit concert. But before we go any further, I need to know if this is something you really want to pursue." Rebecca looked around the restaurant, taking in the scene of the busiest morning they'd had in months. Tyler was in the corner doing homework, occasionally looking up to beam at George with undisguised admiration. Jessica was buzzing tables with more enthusiasm than she'd shown for any task in years. Eleanor was in her usual booth, but today she was actively engaged in conversation with Martha Patterson about old times, her eyes bright and alert. "Yes," Rebecca said firmly. "Yes, I want to try." George's smile was warm with approval. "Good, then let's talk logistics." He pulled out a small notebook and pen. "The way I see it, we need to accomplish several things with this event. First, raise enough money to clear your debts and give you a financial cushion. Second, generate publicity that will bring new customers to the restaurant. And third, create a sense of community investment that will sustain the business long-term." Rebecca nodded, though the scope of what he was proposing still felt overwhelming. "How do we even begin to organize something like that?" "Step by step," George replied, "and with help from people who care about this place. I've already spoken with my management team, and they're willing to handle the production side. Sound equipment, staging, permits, all the technical details. What we need from the community is venue, volunteers, and local coordination." Jake, who had been listening from behind the counter, approached their table with obvious excitement. "The high school football field could easily hold 5,000 people, maybe more if we use the parking lot too. And I know the principal. He'd be thrilled to host something like this." 5,000 people? Rebecca's voice was faint. "George, that seems impossible. There aren't even 5,000 people in the whole county." "Not yet," George said with a grin. But word travels fast in country music circles. By the time we're done promoting this, we'll have folks coming from all over Texas and beyond. Tyler looked up from his homework, his eyes wide behind his glasses. Will there be other famous singers too? George's expression turned mysterious. Well, I might have convinced a few friends to join me, but that's a surprise for later. The front door opened again, and this time it was Tom Bradley from the bank, looking uncomfortable but determined. Rebecca's stomach clenched as she saw him approach their table. "Mrs. Williams," Tom said formally, then paused as he recognized George. "Oh, Mr. Strait, I heard you were in town. Tom Bradley, right?" George stood and extended his hand. "Jake Morrison speaks very highly of you." Tom seemed to relax slightly at the personal connection. "I wanted to speak with Mrs. Williams about her account situation. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Rebecca felt the familiar weight of shame and worry settling over her shoulders. "It's okay, Tom. George knows about our financial situation." Tom glanced between them uncertainly, then seemed to make a decision. "Well then, I suppose you should both know that the bank has been getting calls all morning. Apparently, word has gotten out about a possible benefit concert, and several businesses and individuals have already expressed interest in making donations or becoming sponsors." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "Already? But nothing's even been confirmed yet." "Small towns," George said with a knowing smile. "When they decide to rally around something, they don't waste time." Tom pulled out a folder and opened it on the table. "I've taken the liberty of putting together some preliminary numbers. If this benefit concert generates even modest success, we could work out a payment plan that would keep the restaurant operating while you rebuild your customer base." The conversation that followed was technical and detailed, full of terms like restructured loans and community development partnerships. But the bottom line was simple. For the first time in years, Rebecca had options that didn't involve losing everything. As Tom gathered his papers to leave, he paused and looked directly at Rebecca. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that this bank has been part of this community for over 100 years. We don't want to see institutions like your restaurant disappear any more than you do. Sometimes it just takes a catalyst to remind everyone what's worth fighting for." After Tom left, Rebecca sat in stunned silence, trying to process how quickly her world was changing. 24 hours ago, she'd been alone with problems too big to solve. Now she had allies, options, and something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. "This is really happening, isn't it?" she said softly. George nodded. "It's really happening. But Rebecca, I need you to understand something. This concert, this community support, it's wonderful, but it's just the beginning. The real work starts after the music stops and the crowds go home, building a sustainable business, rebuilding customer loyalty, creating new traditions while honoring old ones. That's going to take everything you've got." Rebecca thought about her great-grandmother Rose, who had built this restaurant from nothing during the Great Depression. She thought about all the sacrifices her family had made over the years, all the dreams that had been invested in these worn wooden floors and cracked vinyl booths. "I'm ready," she said, and for the first time in years, she truly meant it. Eleanor chose that moment to approach their table, moving with more confidence than she'd shown in weeks. "George, dear," she said, "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about this place being a gathering spot for the community." "Yes, Ma'am. Well, I remember when I was young, we used to have regular events here. Poetry readings on Tuesday nights, local musicians on weekends, even book clubs and quilting circles. This restaurant was never just about the food, it was about bringing people together." George's eyes lit up with understanding. "Eleanor, that's brilliant. What if the benefit concert isn't just a one-time event? What if it's the launch of a whole new chapter for the Cedar Creek family diner?" Rebecca felt pieces of a larger vision beginning to come together in her mind. A restaurant that was also a community center, a place where local culture could flourish alongside good food and family traditions. Jessica, who had been wiping down tables nearby, paused in her work. "You mean like a place where local artists could display their work? Or where the high school drama club could perform?" "Exactly," George said enthusiastically. "And maybe cooking classes using old family recipes or storytelling nights where folks share local history." Tyler looked up from his homework again, his face bright with excitement. "Could we have reading groups for kids like me? Kids who need extra help?" Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched her children engage with the future they were helping to create. For so long, they'd all been focused on survival, on just getting through each day. Now they were talking about growth, about possibility, about ways to serve their community that went far beyond simple commerce. "There's just one problem with all these wonderful ideas," Rebecca said, though her tone was warm rather than discouraging. "I don't know the first thing about organizing events or running programs. I'm barely keeping up with the restaurant as it is." George smiled. "That's what community is for, Rebecca. You don't have to do everything yourself, and you'd be surprised how many people are looking for ways to contribute to something meaningful." As if to prove his point, the front door opened once again, and this time it was Pastor Jim from Cedar Creek Methodist, followed by Dr. Patricia Hayes from the local medical clinic, and Bill Henderson, the retired postal worker who'd become something of an unofficial town historian. "I hope we're not interrupting," Pastor Jim said, "but we heard about the benefit concert and we wanted to offer our help." What followed was an impromptu planning session that transformed the back corner of the restaurant into a command center for community action. Pastor Jim offered the church's fellowship hall for planning meetings and volunteer coordination. Dr. Hayes suggested organizing a health fair in conjunction with the concert, providing free screenings and wellness education. Bill Henderson proposed creating a historical display about the restaurant and its role in the town's development. Rebecca listened to the animated discussions with growing amazement. These were people she'd known for years, some of them lifelong residents of Cedar Creek, and they were talking about her family's restaurant as if it were the most important thing in the world. "Why?" she finally asked, interrupting the flow of ideas. "Why are you all willing to do so much for us?" The room fell quiet, and Rebecca worried that she'd offended them with her bluntness. But Pastor Jim's expression was understanding rather than hurt. "Rebecca," he said gently, "do you remember when your great-grandmother used to let the church hold our holiday dinners here during the years when our kitchen was being renovated?" Rebecca nodded. "And when Dr. Hayes' predecessor retired and there was a gap in medical coverage for 3 months, this restaurant became an unofficial triage center where folks could get basic first aid and know they'd be taken care of." Dr. Hayes picked up the thread. "Your family's been taking care of this community for 3 generations, Rebecca. Maybe it's time we returned the favor." And George, who had been quietly observing this exchange, leaned back in his booth with a satisfied smile. "This," he said softly, "is exactly what I was talking about. Community isn't just about geography. It's about people who care enough to show up for each other." As the afternoon wore on and more volunteers arrived, Rebecca began to see not just the possibility of saving her restaurant, but of transforming it into something even greater than it had been before. The Cedar Creek Family Diner could become a symbol of what was possible when people decided to invest in their shared future rather than simply accepting decline as inevitable. By evening, they had tentative dates, preliminary budgets, and a growing list of volunteers that included everyone from high school students to retired teachers. George had made several more phone calls, and the list of performers willing to participate in the benefit concert was growing beyond anything Rebecca could have imagined. "I should probably head out," George said as the volunteers began to disperse. "I've got that show in Dallas tomorrow night, and I need to get some rest." Rebecca walked him to the door, her mind still reeling from the day's developments. "George, I don't know how to thank you for all this. You've given us more than just hope. You've given us a future." George paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. "Rebecca, you and your family gave me something too. You reminded me why I started making music in the first place. To bring people together, to tell stories that matter, to celebrate the things that make us human." He stepped out into the evening air, then turned back with one final thought. "And Rebecca, your great-grandmother Rose was right about music and good food being able to heal any hurt. Sometimes it just takes a little help from friends to remember that." As Rebecca watched George drive away, she felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for his help, but for the reminder that even in the darkest times, unexpected angels could appear to light the way forward. Behind her, Tyler and Jessica were already making plans for how they could help with the benefit concert, their voices filled with an enthusiasm she hadn't heard in years. Eleanor was humming George Strait songs as she helped clear tables, her movements more purposeful than they'd been in months. The Cedar Creek family diner was about to begin a new chapter, and for the first time in years, Rebecca Williams couldn't wait to see what came next. 3 weeks later, the morning of the benefit concert dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp October air that made everything seem possible. Rebecca stood in the doorway of the restaurant at 5 a.m., watching as volunteers streamed across the high school football field in the distance, setting up booths, stringing lights, and preparing for what the local newspaper had dubbed the Concert of Hearts. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity that had transformed not just the restaurant, but the entire town. Word of the benefit had spread far beyond Cedar Creek, picked up by country music blogs, social media, and even a few national news outlets intrigued by the story of George Strait's impromptu visit to a small-town diner. Ticket sales had exceeded everyone's most optimistic projections. What had started as a hope for maybe 1,000 attendees had grown into a sold-out event, expecting over 6,000 people from across Texas and neighboring states. Hotels in nearby towns were booked solid, and the economic impact was already being felt throughout the region. "Mom, you need to eat something," Jessica said, appearing at Rebecca's elbow with a plate of toast and scrambled eggs. At 17, Jessica had somehow transformed into the family's logistics coordinator, keeping track of schedules, volunteers, and the 100 small details that could make or break an event of this magnitude. "I'm too nervous to eat," Rebecca admitted, though she accepted the plate gratefully. "What if something goes wrong? What if the sound system fails, or not enough people show up, or—" "Mom." Tyler's voice was calm and sure as he joined them in the doorway. Over the past 3 weeks, Rebecca's 12-year-old son had gained a confidence that amazed her. Working with the volunteer coordinators, helping with setup, even reading announcements at planning meetings, activities that once would have terrified him now seemed natural. "Everything's going to be perfect." George said so. Rebecca smiled despite her nerves. George had indeed called the night before, his voice warm with excitement and assurance. The lineup of performers he'd assembled was staggering, not just country music stars, but local musicians, the high school choir, and even a surprise guest or two that he'd refused to reveal. "Besides," Jessica added with a grin, "if anything goes wrong, we'll just feed everyone pie and send them home happy." The past 3 weeks had seen a remarkable transformation in Rebecca's children. Tyler's reading had improved dramatically, partly due to the tutoring they could now afford, but mostly because his newfound confidence had broken through the mental barriers that had been holding him back. Jessica had channeled her natural leadership abilities into organizing junior volunteers, and her grades had improved as she found purpose beyond rebellion. Eleanor appeared from the kitchen, moving with a steadiness that had been returning gradually as she found herself useful again. "The pies are all ready," she announced proudly. 47 apple pies, just like Rose used to make for the church socials. The decision to cater the concert themselves had been ambitious, but the entire community had rallied to help. The Methodist Church kitchen, the VFW hall, and even private homes had been enlisted to prepare food for the thousands of expected attendees. It was exactly the kind of community effort that George had envisioned. Jake appeared in the doorway, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Rebecca, you need to see this," he said, gesturing toward the field where the concert stage was being assembled. Rebecca followed him outside, and her breath caught in her throat. The sight that greeted her was beyond anything she could have imagined. The high school football field had been transformed into something magical. A proper concert venue with professional staging, lighting rigs that would have done justice to any major arena, and vendor booths displaying the work of local artisans and businesses. But what truly took her breath away was the people. Even at this early hour, families were already arriving, setting up lawn chairs and blankets, children running between the booths while parents browsed displays of local crafts and photography. The parking lot was filled with vehicles bearing license plates from across the South, and volunteers wearing bright yellow T-shirts with Concert of Hearts logos were directing traffic with cheerful efficiency. "This is incredible," Rebecca whispered. "And it's just the beginning," said a familiar voice behind her. Rebecca turned to find George Strait approaching, but not the casual, down-to-earth man who had wandered into her restaurant 3 weeks ago. This was George Strait, the performer, dressed in stage attire, but somehow still managing to look approachable and genuine. "George!" Tyler ran toward him, and George caught him in a warm hug that spoke to the genuine friendship that had developed between them. "How's my favorite reading partner?" George asked. Tyler had been sending him updates on his progress, and George had responded with encouraging notes that Tyler treasured like gold. "I finished 2 whole books this week," Tyler announced proudly. "And Mom says if I keep improving, I can try out for the school's academic team next year. That's fantastic, son. I'm proud of you." George's smile was warm and genuine. "And how are you holding up, Rebecca? Ready for the big day?" Rebecca looked around at the bustling activity, at her children's excited faces, at the community that had come together around her family's restaurant. "I think so, though I still can't quite believe this is all happening." "Believe it," George said firmly. "And Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you before the show starts, something I've been saving for today." He led her away from the crowd to a quiet spot near the restaurant where they could talk privately. Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety. Surely nothing could go wrong now, not when they were so close to success. "What is it?" she asked. George's expression was serious, but not alarming. "I've been talking with some investors, people who specialize in preserving historic businesses and supporting community development. They're very interested in the Cedar Creek family diner." Rebecca's heart skipped. "Investors? George, I don't want to sell the restaurant. That's not what this is about." "Not selling," George said quickly. "Investing. There's a group that provides funding and expertise to help businesses like yours not just survive, but thrive. They're particularly interested in the community center aspect we've been discussing." He pulled out a folder and handed it to her. "They're prepared to offer a partnership that would provide capital for renovations, equipment upgrades, and program development. You'd retain full ownership and control, but you'd have the resources to really make this place everything it could be." Rebecca opened the folder and stared at the numbers, hardly believing what she was seeing. It was more than enough to not only save the restaurant, but to transform it into the community gathering place they'd been dreaming about. "George, this is too much. How do I know I won't mess it up? What if I can't live up to everyone's expectations?" George smiled. Rebecca, 3 weeks ago you thought you were alone, with problems too big to solve. Look around you. Look at what you've inspired. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to care, and you've already proven you do that better than anyone. Before Rebecca could respond, Jessica came running over, her face flushed with excitement. Mom, you have to come see this. There are people here from 3 different TV stations, and someone from Nashville wants to interview you. Rebecca felt a moment of panic. I don't know what to say to reporters. Just tell them the truth, George advised. Tell them about your family, about this restaurant, about what community means. That's a story worth hearing. The next few hours passed in a blur of interviews, sound checks, and last-minute preparations. Rebecca found herself telling the story of the Cedar Creek family diner over and over, each time discovering new details about what made it special, new reasons why it mattered. The local news crews were joined by reporters from Dallas and Houston, and even a crew from Nashville documenting the event for a country music television special. Each interview helped Rebecca understand more clearly what they'd accomplished, not just saving a restaurant, but proving that communities could still come together around shared values and common purpose. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd continued to grow. Families spread blankets on the grass, vendors sold everything from barbecue to handmade jewelry, and local musicians performed on a smaller stage while the main act prepared for the evening show. The atmosphere was festive but warm, more like a county fair than a commercial concert. Dr. Hayes had set up her health fair in the school gymnasium, offering free blood pressure checks, diabetes screenings, and health education. Pastor Jim was coordinating a food drive that had already collected hundreds of items for the local food bank. Even the high school students had organized a car wash fundraiser, with proceeds going to support the restaurant's new community programs. Mom, look! Tyler called out, pointing to a group of children gathered around a storytelling circle where Bill Henderson was sharing tales of Cedar Creek's early days. They're telling the story about great-great-grandma Rose hiding people in the basement during the war. Rebecca watched as a dozen children listened with rapt attention to stories that might otherwise have been lost to time. This was what George had meant about preserving more than just a business. They were preserving the community's memory, its sense of itself. Eleanor, who had been helping serve pie samples from a booth near the main stage, approached with tears in her eyes. Rebecca, dear, do you see what's happening here? Rebecca followed her mother's gaze and saw what had moved her to tears. Scattered throughout the crowd were elderly residents of Cedar Creek, many of whom rarely left their homes anymore, being pushed in wheelchairs or walking with assistance provided by younger volunteers. The concert had become not just a fundraiser, but a community reunion, bringing together generations that too often lived in isolation. Mrs. Rodriguez from the nursing home is here, Eleanor continued, and the Johnson family drove down from Dallas just because they heard about it on the radio. People are coming home, Rebecca. They're remembering what this place means to them. As evening approached and the crowd swelled to capacity, Rebecca felt a mixture of nervous excitement and profound gratitude. The financial goal had already been exceeded. Ticket sales, vendor fees, and donations had raised more than enough to pay off the restaurant's debts and provide a substantial operating cushion. But the real success was harder to quantify and more valuable than money. George found her standing at the edge of the field, watching families settle in for the evening show. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Overwhelmed," Rebecca admitted. 3 weeks ago, I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it's just beginning." "That's exactly right," George said. "And Rebecca, there's one more thing I wanted to tell you before I go on stage. This event, this community response, it's not just about you or your restaurant. It's about people remembering that they have the power to shape their own future, that they don't have to just accept decline and loss as inevitable." He gestured toward the crowd, where thousands of people were sharing food, music, and stories under the Texas stars. Look at what happened when people decided to care about something together. That's not magic. That's democracy in action, community in action. And it all started because one woman cared enough about her family's legacy to keep fighting for it, even when everything seemed hopeless. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes. "George, I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done for us." "You already have," he replied. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place, because it brings people together around the things that matter most. Now, I better go get ready. We've got a show to put on." As George walked toward the backstage area, Rebecca was joined by Jake, who had been coordinating security and logistics all day with the efficiency of a seasoned event manager. "Everything's ready," he reported. "Sound check went perfectly. All the performers are here, and I've never seen a crowd this excited for anything in Cedar Creek." "Jake," Rebecca said impulsively, "when this is all over, when things settle down, would you consider becoming my business partner? I'm going to need help managing all the new programs we're planning, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather work with." Jake's weathered face broke into a smile. "Rebecca Williams, I thought you'd never ask. It would be my honor." At 8 o'clock, as the last light faded from the western sky and the stage lights came up bright, Pastor Jim took the microphone to welcome the crowd and introduce the evening's purpose. His words were simple but moving, speaking of community, resilience, and the power of people coming together around shared values. The first performer was Tyler's middle school choir, their young voices soaring over the crowd with amazing grace, in an arrangement that had been specifically chosen to honor the spiritual foundation of the community's effort. Rebecca watched her son in the back row, his face glowing with pride and confidence, and she felt her heart might burst with joy. Local musicians followed, a bluegrass band formed by high school teachers, a gospel quartet from the Baptist church, and a folk singer who had been performing at the restaurant's monthly open mic nights that had started just 2 weeks earlier. Each act was warmly received, but the crowd's anticipation continued to build. Then George Strait took the stage, and 6,000 people rose to their feet as one. "Good evening, Cedar Creek," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the field. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for supporting the Williams family and the Cedar Creek Family Diner, and for proving that small towns and big hearts can still change the world." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to go on forever. When it finally died down, George continued. 3 weeks ago, I had the privilege of meeting one of the finest families I've ever known, in one of the most authentic restaurants I've ever visited. Tonight, I want to share their story with you, and I want to celebrate what happens when a community decides to fight for what matters. What followed was not just a concert, but a celebration of everything that made small-town America special. George performed his greatest hits, but he also invited local musicians to join him on stage, turning the evening into a collaborative celebration of regional music and culture. Between songs, he told stories about the restaurant, about Rose Williams and her legacy, about Rebecca's determination and her children's courage. He spoke about Eleanor's battle with Alzheimer's and how the love of her community was helping her maintain her dignity and sense of purpose. He talked about Tyler's learning challenges and how support and encouragement could help any child overcome obstacles. "I want to introduce you to some very special people," George said during a lull in the music. "Rebecca Williams and her family, would you please join me on stage?" Rebecca felt panic flutter in her chest, but Jessica took her hand, Tyler grabbed the other, and before she knew it, they were walking onto the stage in front of 6,000 people, with Eleanor moving slowly but proudly beside them. The crowd's applause was thunderous, But what moved Rebecca most was the warmth in their faces, the genuine affection and support that seemed to radiate from every person in the audience. These weren't just spectators at a concert. They were neighbors, friends, and fellow travelers who understood the struggles her family had faced and celebrated their resilience. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said as the applause finally died down, "the Williams family represents the very best of American values: hard work, determination, family loyalty, and the courage to keep fighting even when the odds seem impossible. But tonight, you've all proven something equally important: that communities still have the power to take care of their own, to preserve what's precious, and to build a future worthy of the past they've inherited." As the evening drew to a close, George saved his most powerful moment for last. Instead of ending with one of his signature songs, he asked the entire crowd to join him in singing "Amarillo Morning," the same song that had been playing on the restaurant's jukebox the night he first visited. 6,000 voices rose together under the Texas stars, singing about hope, home, and the promise of new beginnings. Rebecca stood on that stage, surrounded by her family, looking out at a sea of faces that represented not just her community, but her future. And she felt a peace and joy that she hadn't experienced in years. When the last note faded and the applause finally died away, George turned to Rebecca one final time. "The music's stopping," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "but the real work is just beginning. Are you ready?" Rebecca looked out at the crowd, at her children beside her, at the restaurant in the distance where 4 generations of her family had served their community with love and dedication. She thought about the investment partnership that would allow them to expand their programs, about the new customers who would discover them through tonight's publicity, about the community center they could build and the lives they could touch. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctant to let the magic of the evening end. But Rebecca knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Tomorrow, the real work would start. There would be renovations to plan, programs to develop, relationships to build. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the old fears would try to return. But tonight had proven something that would sustain her through whatever came next. When people come together around something they believe in, when they choose community over isolation and hope over despair, there's no limit to what they can accomplish. As the Williams family made their way back to the restaurant, followed by dozens of volunteers eager to help with cleanup and planning, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But it was a different kind of weight than she'd carried before. Not the crushing burden of problems too big to solve, but the energizing challenge of possibilities too exciting to ignore. The Cedar Creek family diner had been saved, but more importantly, it had been transformed. No longer just a restaurant struggling to survive, it had become a symbol of what was possible when people refused to give up on the things that mattered most. George Strait had kept his promise. He'd helped them remember that music and good food really could heal any hurt. But the healing that had taken place in Cedar Creek went far beyond one family's financial troubles. An entire community had rediscovered its capacity for compassion, cooperation, and hope. And in a small Texas town where progress had seemed to mean only loss and decline, a new story was being written. One that would inspire other communities, other families, other dreamers who refused to believe that the best days were behind them. The Concert of Hearts was over, but its legacy would resonate for generations to come. And at the center of it all stood a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to give up, and the greatest magic is the willingness of good people to care for one another. Rebecca Williams opened the door to her restaurant, where the lights were warm and welcoming, where the aroma of fresh coffee and apple pie still lingered in the air, where 4 generations of memories waited to be joined by countless more. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. Home, surrounded by family and community, ready to write the next chapter of a story that was far from over. The Cedar Creek family diner was open for business, and the future had never looked brighter.